Good afternoon. I'm Alan Matisow of the Baker Institute, and I'm glad to welcome everybody to this luncheon event. I'm the moderator. Ambassador Djerejian is the star. I think this is a special event, not only because of the remarkable collection of talent that we've gathered here for the conference, but also because this is the last occasion in which Ambassador Djerejian will be on this platform as the founding director of the Baker Institute. He has, of course, had a remarkable career beginning in the Foreign Service, had significant postings, rose to be the ambassador of Syria and Israel, and was assistant of the Near East section of the State Department. He's been here for 28 years at the Baker Institute, took this institution from virtually nothing to the distinction it now has. And in all that time, he remained a Middle East hand. He never lost interest in it, participated in it in various ways. He's been the director of our Middle East Center here at the Institute. He was in the Iraq study group in 2004 in Iraq. He's been very active in Track 2 diplomacy with the Israelis and the Palestinians. Been in touch in all these years with the State Department. He's still someone that the media goes to when they want some insights on current events. So what's going to happen here today is the ambassador is going to reflect on a career that has been devoted to the study of the Middle East. In a sense, this is a culmination of his 28 years here and his long career. So we'll have a conversation for about 35 minutes, and then we'll invite questions from the floor. Mr. Ambassador, you have heard today many references to your Meridian speech in May of 1992. And that speech was regarded at the time and still as a major statement of American foreign policy in the Middle East. And when you retired from the State Department to come to Houston, Secretary Warren Christopher wrote you a letter. And in that letter, he gives you credit for, and this is a quote, the Djerejian Doctrine on American relations with the Islamic world, which has earned a permanent place in the annals of American diplomatic history. So when they name a doctrine after you, it means you've been pretty successful. But I wonder if you would share with us how it came to be that you gave that speech.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you, everyone. We've had a great morning and very good sessions again this afternoon. I try to keep that phrase that Warren Christopher put in there, the Georgian Doctrine, quiet, because I never want to get Henry Kissinger angry at me, because only Henry wants to have doctrines named after him, and a lowly Assistant Secretary of State who had a doctrine named after him would cause me problems. But I'll tell you, it was an interesting development. I'm sitting in Washington and head of, at that time, the Near East South Asia Bureau, and this is the time, of course, as you remember, it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War was ending its historic period, and we began to grapple with the new geopolitical landscape that we had to deal with, and which was really unknown. It's interesting how countries and sometimes individuals define themselves by their enemies. Well, the enemy was gone. We woke up and the Soviet Union was not the arch enemy anymore. We were predominant, we became predominant. And as all of you know, because you're a very erudite audience here, people were beginning to define what's the next adversary, what's the next challenge. And I was noting my perch there in Washington of think tanks, experts, policymakers, the press, and they were coming up with various themes. One of which began to disturb me, given my responsibilities for the Middle East and South Asia, was a tendency to define Islam as the next enemy. After the fall of communism, Islamism was going to be perhaps our arch foe. And I didn't pay much attention to it. I thought it was sort of just commentary from various corners, but then it began to take more shape. Now, this is 1992. And I decided that we better define what our challenges are in a much more responsible manner, and began to have meetings with academics. I invited them to the State Department, scholars, one or two maybe here. And then I had meetings with my peers at the Assistant Secretary level from Defense, from CIA, from an NSC, and then various experts, and we began to put together a concept. I was really marked by my Jesuit training at Georgetown. Something many of you may have never heard of is the fallacy of composition at St. Thomas Aquinas. And that those of us who are victims of a Jesuit education, they're great educators, but they really have an impact on you. So to St. Thomas Aquinas said, if the truth is this long, and you focus on only one part of the truth, and extrapolate from that part into a whole concept, that's the fallacy of composition. And what I thought I was beginning to witness out there was that we were in search for a new ism. So I decided that, and this is of course Sam Huntington, very prevalent, and others who were advocating the role of religion in politics, etc. So long story short, I decided I should give a speech on trying to define at least what American policy interests would be after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the Middle East. So we worked on it for a couple of months. And all these deliberations we had with these groups I mentioned, I had two very bright Foreign Service officers working for me, and I picked up a very terrible habit from Henry Kissinger, for Secretary Kissinger. He would never look at the first three drafts of what anyone gave him. And I felt that was really irresponsible, but I did it. And so the first two drafts, I said, not good enough. Out in the outbox, go back to the drawing boards. But I defined to them what I wanted to say. And what I wanted to say is basically that the next ism that the United States must face after the fall of communism and after our defeat of fascism and Nazism is not any one world culture or religion, but extremism of either a secular or religious cloak. Now, this is 1992. 1993 was the first World Trade Center bombing. And then by so defining it in a manner in which we weren't, accusing any religious group or civilization for being behind it, but saying that we had to be sensitive to both secular extremism and religious extremism. And my personal view is one of the great toxic combinations is the combination of religion and politics. I think it's absolutely toxic. Our founding fathers, the separation of church and state, synagogue and state, minaret and state, I mean, it's fundamental in the American ethos. But when we have this confluence of religion and politics, it causes a lot of trouble. So I decided that, you know, I had to come out with this. Now, as the first panel that Kadir, excellent panel, all the two panels we've had this morning were excellent, but they've gone through this in quite some detail, the Meridian House speech and what it contains, so I'm not going to repeat that. But it was very important, I felt, that we had to make a policy statement. So the speech was done. I sent it to Secretary of State Baker. Never got an answer. The June 4th date was, the June 2nd date at Meridian House was coming up. I had to see him on something else. He was in his back office, and I said, by the way, Mr. Secretary, have you had a chance to review the draft of the speech I'm giving? He said, no, I don't have time. You know, I'm so busy, I don't have time to read it. But by the way, what are you going to say? And so I told him in very brief terms, well, I'm going to say this and this and this, what I just mentioned. And he looked at me, he said, you be careful, Ed. And I walked out of that office saying that was not a yes, that was not a no, but I knew what part of my anatomy was on the line. That when I gave the speech, and actually the speech did make a lot of noise. The one person, I was being gender neutral, one person, one vote, one time. But it was blazoned in Arabic headlines, Al-Akhbar and everything, one man, one vote, one time. And we did have our eye, as was mentioned in the panel, on the Algerian elections and the possibility of the Islamic Party coming into power into Algeria. But at the same time, as was noted, and I'm glad it was noted in the panel, I also specified that we had to be aware of secular extremism as well as religious extremism. So that's the story of how it came to be. And one thing that I think was important, and I'd like to see policymakers throughout Democratic and Republican administrations do more often, if I can use that word often, I think we have to be more clear in our Democratic and Republican administrations at what we stand for. And to clarify, I think one of the things that bothers me the most, Alan, today, and I'm thinking of the Ukraine crisis, as well as the issues that we're dealing with in the Middle East, I really feel that we're losing, in Washington and other capitals, the ability to strategize. And what do I mean by that? The ability for our administrations, policymakers, to step back and look long-term and to try what could be called anticipatory diplomacy, preventive diplomacy, that was so well done during the Eisenhower-Truman administration, the post-Cold War period, with the Marshall Plan. We mentioned the Truman Doctrine in very interesting terms this morning. But I think for example, let me use the Ukraine. For 12 years, at least, we have known about the Gerasimov Doctrine. Valery Gerasimov is the chief staff of the Russian armed forces. That doctrine is Putin's agenda. We've known about that for 12 to 13 years. And there are three major points. One, Russia must do everything to work for a multipolar world where the United States is no longer preeminent. Number two, Russia has to oppose the eastward expansion of NATO. Number three, Russia should have a primary role in the near abroad of the former Soviet Republic. You have these frozen conflicts, Abkhazia, Ossetia. He worked on that. He moved on Crimea. We now have the crisis in Ukraine. This was coming. We should have anticipated this. One of my mentors was Ambassador Raymond Hare, And he told me that the art of diplomacy is really the ability to listen. Learn and master your adversary's or your interlocutor's brief even better than perhaps he or she can articulate it. Engage with your adversaries, because as Secretary Baker keeps reminding me, you make peace with your enemies, you don't make peace with your friends. And part of diplomacy is engaging with our adversaries. We should have engaged with Putin on the Gerasimov Doctrine, knowing full well, and we have the experts in our government, knowing full well that this so-called frozen conflict in Ukraine was going to blow up in our faces, as did Nagorno-Karabakh between the Azeris and the Armenians, who brought in Turkey. We're talking about a frozen conflict today in Palestine. It's a frozen conflict that has the ability to blow up in our faces at the most inopportune times. And the excellent analysis that we heard of the conflict leaves me even more disturbed, because it is a status quo that is leading to, I think, worst case scenarios, and we can talk about that. The panel discussed it in length, but I can make a few comments on that if we wish. But the point I'm making here is that one of the biggest lessons that we should learn is that we have to get back to the period whereby our administrations are no longer mostly reactive to events, but not only deal with the events that they have to deal with in the crises, but that they begin to strategize for long-term solutions. And the art of diplomacy, to continue with Raymond Hare, he told me, I was a young diplomat when he was telling me this, he said, you listen, you master your adversary or your interlocutor's brief, you convey to him, her, that you understand their interests. And then you present your interests and your position. And then you determine in negotiations whether there's any common ground. And if there is common ground, you build on it. If there is no common ground, then you have to make the determination of what the consequences are. In a worst case scenario, that can lead to war, conflict, or coming up with solutions that are not peace or a settlement, but that keep the situation stable and not kinetic. The other thing I learned as a young diplomat, I had the great opportunity, my first job in the State Department was during the Kennedy administration. It shows you how old I am. I started out in the Kennedy administration. I tell this joke, my colleagues know this joke. You know, in the Middle East they say, I'm so old I can remember the Dead Sea when it was only sick. So you know, but George Ball was my greatest mentor. Why? Well, he was Deputy Secretary of State. And I remember I was carrying his briefcase around. That was my job, in helping him write speeches. He once burst into my office and said, how many troops did Alexander the Great have when he was conquering the world? Because he was preparing his briefs for John F. Kennedy and then Lyndon Baines Johnson's on why the United States should not get engaged in a land war in Indochina. He was one of the very few voices at the very top of the Kennedy and the LBJ administrations who was advocating against the commitment of US troops to Vietnam. And he had the political courage and the competence and the integrity to state his position when almost everyone else, the McNamaras, the Rostows, and all the others were advocating for involvement. In fact, Kennedy told him, I remember Ball telling, he said, you know, Mr. President, if you send these 4,000 military advisors to Vietnam, South Vietnam, in about 3 or 4 years we'll have 500,000 troops in Indochina. We call it Indochina. And Kennedy laughed. He said, George, you're out of your mind. And then we know how it ruined LBJ's brilliant presidency on domestic affairs, but that, and you know, you're a historian on this, how it had really ruined LBJ's presidency. So what I'm saying here is that one of the lessons I'm drawing from what I'm hearing this morning and what we're witnessing in Ukraine, in our government and in our think tanks, in academia, whatever we can do to help get us back to a period when this country and this government can begin to get back to strategy is very important. And I'm not that confident. I'm not that confident. It's easy to say, but we need the people to go into public service who can do this, and we need our leaders to inculcate it. So that's sort of a long-winded way of how I wrote the Meridian House, delivered the Meridian House speech, and I benefited a great deal from the discussion and what it means today from our excellent panelists.
How many troops did Alexander the Great have?
You know, that, I hate to say it, but you know, I'm retiring. In 1963, when Ball asked me to come up with these statistics, we had a dusty old library in the State Department. We didn't have Google. We didn't have web. I had to go into the dusty State Department library and find a damn book that would have information on how many troops. So I came up with a figure of 18,000. And to this day, I don't know if that's right or not, but that went into the memorandum to the president.
That is how history gets written. Well, we had that excellent panel this morning on the Arab-Israeli problem, and it's something you've been engaged with for decades yourself. So what is your assessment of the situation going forward?
Well, I'm pessimistic. I think, as reasonably we heard from the excellent discussion in the panel this morning, I'm pessimistic about the prospects. I think the leadership on both sides of the two parties I call fragile. Despite Israel's political military might, their government is a very fragile coalition. I don't see any decision-making there that could keep the coalition together. They simply have no domestic political interest in engaging in land for peace because it'll bring down the coalition. The Palestinian leadership, unfortunately, someone in the panel said Palestinian rulers, not democratically elected leaders, has shown its incapability of seizing opportunities, but also leading their people toward what should be statehood. So it's a very complex but a very dire landscape. The issues were well described in the panel this morning, and I think the fundamental factor is that you've got these 7 million Israelis, Jews on one side, you've got 7 million odd Palestinians on the other side, in between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Neither one is going anywhere. They've got to know how to share the land, but more importantly, as was described, to divide the land. Partition, end of occupation, and then from there move on toward either a confederation, two-state solution, whatever it is. But it is all about land for peace, and you can't get away from that. The Abraham Accords can't get away from that. It's for land for peace, and that's what makes it so seemingly unresolvable today. But there's no question in my mind, we've had an in-depth discussion on the two-state solution. I am an advocate of the two-state solution, but every day that passes, it's becoming less viable. And I remember when we were in Ramallah before COVID, we took a delegation, and Khalil Shikaki, the pollster and the Palestinian pollster, and I was really struck. I met with young Palestinians. Sammy, you know this, and it was amazing. At that time, the polls have changed now, but at that time, a growing minority of Palestinian youth were advocating the one-state solution. And they were saying, why should we create yet another Arab autocratic state called Palestine? Like all the other corrupt regimes, these are their words. Why don't we go for a one-state solution? Of course, from their point of view, with equal rights. But that poses the issue of the survival or the existence of a democratic Jewish state. In my personal view, for Israel to be and remain a democratic Jewish state, it has to end the occupation. It has to come to an agreement with the Palestinians on the lines. A one-state solution with equal rights will be the destruction of that concept of a democratic Jewish state. A one-state solution with unequal rights is South Africa during apartheid. And therefore, the long-term future of Israel, as someone said, what is the existential threat to Israel? Is it Iran? No. It's this issue. This issue is the existential threat to Israel, and it's an existential threat to the Palestinian people. So self-determination has to be achieved one way or the other. And to get there, there was a very interesting discussion this morning on Palestinian rights. And that is essential, outside of the context of an agreement. But the Palestinians have their rights for self-determination. They're not going anywhere. So everything that we've worked on, and we've worked on these issues, and we came to territorial compromises, they're all there. It's all feasible if the political will and the leadership is there. I think when I was ambassador to Israel, I really admired Yitzhak Rabin. We formed a good personal relationship. But his assassination set back the peace process by decades, I think. Because in my experience, and this is a truism, leaders make a difference. Leaders make a difference. We need institutions. They're critical. But at the end of the day, when you see remarkable moves forward, it's done by leaders who know how to gain the support of the people and public opinion. And Rabin represented that because he had proven himself as the warrior of Israel, and yet made that critical decision to work for peace and gave up his life for that. He paid for that with his life by, of all things, a Jewish terrorist. So, the situation, we don't have the leadership now on any side that I see. And, leaders like Rabin, for example, we went into Iraq in 2003, which I think is one of the most serious miscalculations in contemporary American foreign policy in the Middle East. And I knew intimately the decision makers on that. The Rumsfelds, Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, all the neocons. And we knew we were going to go to war here. And so I partnered with Frank Wisner and the Ambassador Wisner and the Council on Foreign Relations. We came out with a report in January 2003. We went to war in March, so this is not ex post facto. And we were very concerned about going to war because I knew the ideological motivation of the neocons on this, which I opposed. They wanted regime change in the Arab world, overthrow the dictators, and start creating Arab democracies, and that Israel will be more secure if it's surrounded by Arab democracies than by secular autocratic leaders. This was the mindset behind, because I forgot the name of the think tank they came from, but you probably know there was a think tank at the time that they came from. And you know, I was contrasting their mindset with a conversation I had with Rabin once over a couple of glasses of scotch, in which I'll never forget, he said, you know, if Israel has to wait for our Arab neighbors to become democratic, we will be waiting 1,000 years, quote unquote. Here you have the Prime Minister of Israel, who understands the Arab world much better than the neocons, who felt that by regime change they were going to really bolster Israel's security. So we did a report here in January, published it, and we went to Washington and we peddled it. I went to Wolfowitz, I went directly to them, and we had three major points in that report. If you go into Iraq, if we go into Iraq, which we knew we were going to do not dismantle the Iraqi military. Get rid of the goons at the top, or else the United States is going to have to provide the military security of the country. Point number two, this was based on my experience of being ambassador to Syria, the other Ba'athist party, the Iraqi Ba'athi party, the Syrian Ba'athi party. The Ba'ath party is your Tammany Hall. The Ba'ath party is what keeps the country going. Sanitation, waterworks, electricity, civil administration, the postal service. Don't get rid of the Ba'ath party. Again, get rid of the goons at the top. But don't get rid of the party, or else we will have to assume, the United States, the running of the country. Edict number one was the dismantlement of the Iraqi army. Edict number two by Paul Bremer was the dissolution of the Ba'ath party. Disastrous. We didn't know what we were doing. So, yes, there were people who knew what not to do, but the people who were making the decisions didn't have a clue as to the cultural, political environment that they were working in. Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State, he and I had a very close relationship. He called me and he said, I understand you're doing this report. I understand you have an excellent energy center at the Institute. Can you do an addendum on whether or not Iraqi's oil revenues will be able to finance the reconstruction of Iraq after the war? We put that addendum in. I forget the exact figures, but he said it would cost at least $5 billion of foreign direct investment and maybe 3 to 4 years for get Iraqi production up. I'm sitting at my home at the time here at Houston after I personally briefed Paul Wolfowitz on our report. And he's on CNN for a clip, and they asked him this question: who's going to pay for the reconstruction? He said, Iraqi oil. It was one of the, this is one of the bad things about being both in government and then heading a think tank. When you're in government, you make decisions. When you're a think tank, you advise. And we should have no illusions, those of us who are on the outside. It's a very critical role that think tanks have, and we can have influence. But all we do is advise. People on the inside decide. But, you know, I got up and I poured myself a stiff Macallan, and I said to myself, you lie. You're lying to the American public. So here, I think what we have to draw the lesson is much more humility in what we do in this new evolving Middle East. I think we need, you'll notice in the I think I'm right on this. In the Meridian House speech, I really don't. The only time I mention democracy is the analog of we should not parachute in a Jeffersonian model of democracy into the sands of Arabia. But I never use in my recommendations in that we should pressure these countries to become democratic. Alan, the term I use is we should urge these countries to broader political participation. And I chose those words very carefully because we shouldn't try to inculcate our cultural norms or our political norms on these societies. It has to be according to their cultural context. For example, the Majlis al-Shuras in the Arab world, expand them. And actually in Saudi Arabia, they started doing that early on, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Christian, under King Abdullah. They started expanding the Majlis al-Shura. And I use that as expand the institutions you have to broaden political participation. But America should not try to impose its image, its form of democracy. And I think that's just wrong. So going forward, I think we have to take a look at our military posture in the Middle East. This talk about the United States, and we'll get into this in the next panel, retreating from the Middle East is, I think, overblown. But we have to choose our commitments much more intelligently.
Well, Rabin seemed to have an insight on the future of democracy in the Arab world, and you were quite cautious in dealing with that in the Meridian House speech. But virtually every administration in the United States keeps saying that promoting democracy is a foundation of American foreign policy in the Middle East. So is there any hope for that, and how would we actually have a policy that promoted it?
Well, I think the best policy for the United States to promote democracy in the Middle East and elsewhere is to fix our own democracy, as has been stated here. I think if we want to be, I'm moving to Boston, the shining city on the hill. If we want to be the shining city on the hill, we have to repair our own democracy here. If we want to be influential in promoting democracy throughout the world, we have to better our own example. We have serious problems in our own country now with these harsh partisan divisions in our country. You know, we talk about the Middle East and extremist groups, be it in Israel or in the Arab world. We have our extremist groups here. We have the groups on the margins that dictate policy beyond their numbers. So when you get into voting rights, when you get into cultural issues, when you're getting into infrastructure, when we're talking about everything that needs to be done in America, gun rights, all of this, we have to improve our own democracy. And to me, by so doing, that will be the most influential manner in which we can promote democracy abroad.
We have about 10 minutes for questions from the floor. Sir?
Yes, thank you for your comments, particularly your comments on strategy and how we're not doing enough of it, if we're doing any of it. I know when I used to go to Africa for work, all of my professional peers knew Romanian or Hungarian or Russian because the Soviets had sent them all to school. And, you know, the Soviets were wrong, but they were smart. Currently, we have, I know every year about 30,000 student visas from KSA and from elsewhere around the Middle East and around the world. Are the universities going to do essentially the strategic work in carrying our message forward that is not happening at other levels? Thank you.
No, I think the role of universities and think tanks is really important. And because, and I think we're very fortunate in America to have extraordinarily good universities, you know, throughout the world. Our problem in America is K through 12. That's what we have to fix in terms of education. By the shining city on the hill, we have to fix our educational system in K through 12. But our universities are great. We have great universities. Everyone wants many, you know, look at how many foreign applications there are to our universities. Universities have a critical role, think tanks have a critical role of analyzing the issues and coming up with cogent policy recommendations. What I think we have to do better on the outside as universities and think tanks is how we get the word across to the decision makers. There are certain universities and think tanks that do that better, and others that just don't do it, and feel very happy if they get a nice printed copy of their deliberations and it goes nowhere. So it's like a tree falling, you know, in the forest. If there's no one there, what's their sound? By the way, I have an analogy to that. I say in terms of marriage, if a husband goes to a cocktail party without his wife and expresses an opinion, is he still wrong? I'm saying that because my wife's not here today. So.
Ambassador Djerejian.
Yes.
Thank you so much for everything you've done, for your wonderful contribution to this country as a diplomat, as an academic visionary. This institution is amazing. I also want to congratulate you on the recognition that this wonderful institution has been deemed the #1 in the world. Thank you so much. And for me, over all these years, I've learned so much here. It's been beyond my wildest dreams to be a part of this, to be a part. I travel the world just in this room and next door with these great scholars, these esteemed, distinguished speakers. My question to you, in your book, Opportunity and Danger, you speak about the importance of public diplomacy, the voice of America. Would you please elaborate on that and its importance in today's context? Thank you.
Well, I was asked by Secretary Colin Powell at the time, to chair a bipartisan group on public diplomacy in the Arab world. It was congressionally mandated. And so the congressional mandate, and I laughed when Colin Powell asked me this on the phone. He said, "Ed, Congress wants us to find, why do the Arabs hate us?" And I laughed. He said, "Don't laugh, this is serious. It's a congressional mandated thing. I want you to chair my bipartisan committee," which we did. And it was a valuable experience. I brought together a bipartisan group of experts from all fields, and we traveled in the region, and we came up with our conclusions, which have been used by each successive administration in altered forms. It's evolved. But one thing that was very important is the Raymond Hare experience: listen, learn. And we define public diplomacy as first listening, learning, and only after you've listened and you've learned about the country that you're dealing with or the region you're dealing with, did you start informing and trying to influence. Listen, learn, and then only start to inform and influence your interests as the United States of America. So we defined that process, if you will, and then they created an Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, and then each bureau had a Public Diplomacy Deputy Assistant Secretary, so the report had impact. Public diplomacy is not PR. Public diplomacy is the ability of a country to express its moral values and its national security interests in a coherent, effective manner. And in the Israeli-Palestinian context, we learned, and I'm looking at my colleagues here, we've been in the trenches. We've seen where we, the negotiators, you know, we get out, we make progress, we get out this far, we're narrowing the differences, but we didn't pay attention to public opinion, and public opinion is still back there. So when the crunch time comes to make decisions, the leaders stall because the public is not with them. And therefore, the major point that we tried to make in this public diplomacy report was, in the conduct of diplomacy, you have to marry your negotiating strategies with your public diplomacy. It's not PR, you're not selling a product. Bring the public along with you. And that means informing your constituencies, in this case the Israelis and the Palestinians, the Arabs, that what is happening, and so that when you get to the point where you make a decision, you at least have public support.
Anybody else? Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry.
Perfectly okay. I really appreciated your comments about the importance of leaders and leadership, but specifically leaders. And those of us that have roamed the hallways of the Baker Institute have certainly seen photographs of the tremendous leaders that have come through here. I'm very curious about who you would say you were the most surprised by. Not who you were impressed by, not who you liked the most, not who you agreed with, but who surprised you?
No one surprised me. No one surprised me, but the person who impressed me the most of all, it was Nelson Mandela. When we had him here in 1999, I think. And we had, you know, we didn't have a forum large enough for the interest. My wife suggested to me, you better have this in the basketball court. And we did, and we had 6,500 people. And we went out to the African American and Latino communities, HISD, high school, social sciences, because how many times in their lives would they be able to see in person this iconic man of color? And so the place was packed. And Nelson Mandela at that time, he was frail. He was frail. And so the audience, I mean, you could hear a pin drop in the basketball. I mean, you could hear a pin drop. And I had to field at the end about 500 written Q's and A's. And so I was on one podium and he was on the other podium. And he gave an excellent speech. And to me, it was the most meaningful leader we've had here because he represents reconciliation. Reconciliation. You talk about the Israeli-Arab thing, reconciliation. You talk about all these other conflicts, reconciliation. You talk about bilateral relations, where is the point of reconciliation? This man who gets out of prison for, 27 years and extends his hand to his captors, reconciliation. Iconic. So I'm fielding all these questions over here, and just one glance, I glanced at one, and I said, oh my God, this is the last question I'm going to ask him. And it said, Mr. President, I am a 12th grader, and I would like to know who you really are, and what you think history will say of you. I said, great question. So I asked him this question at the end. And he sort of glances at me. If you've ever seen Nelson Mandela, he has this twinkle in his eye. And he had the twinkle in his eye, and then he stares out into this vast audience. He says, well, you know, people try to make me into a saint or an angel. I'm neither. But if your definition of a saint or an angel is that of a sinner who just keeps on trying, I may qualify. It brought the house down. So he's my favorite.
Ambassador, I think I can speak on behalf of the audience to thank you for a wonderful 45 minutes. I just wish it was longer.
We've got 2 more panels to go through.
Your stories are always wonderful, and we just scratched the surface. So let's say thank you to the ambassador for a wonderful.
Thank you.